Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space. I hope you enjoy. The General and His Lute, written by Random 3 Acts. General Domain of the 5th Octurian Planetary Defense Force was in a terrible situation. After a disastrous battle, he had been separated from his army. Arriving at the fortress city of Lute, he was greeted by a meager garrison of only 100 men. 100 men to defend a fortress, a city that would usually have a garrison of 4,000 to 5,000. He knew the clock to his end must indeed be ticking, but he had a duty, and he would fulfill that duty to the very end. Meeting with the garrison commander, a young man barely in his 20s, and clearly only in command by virtue of the only one being left, he had to speak strategy. "How far away is the enemy?" the general asked. "About a week. Maybe a little less if they're force-marched," the young man answered. This was worse than he expected. The nearest force that could reinforce him was a good 2 weeks away at best, and that was just to get word for help, not even for them to arrive. "What are their numbers?" he asked. "Our few scouts estimate roughly 13,000, with further 8,000 following behind them. If they were also to add to the caravan guard to their force, they'd number 25,000, the young man answered. Despite everything, the general had to hand it to the boy. Young though he may be, he was working harder than anyone else to appraise what was going on. "What are supplies and numbers like?" he asked. "We have 120 soldiers, 150 if we recall the scouts. On the supply front, we can last maybe 5 days, he answered. The general internally cursed. This was because of his fellow generals claiming all the supplies and men they could, only to lose them to that horde of insectoid monsters. The general himself barely escaped with his life, watching as his men were torn to shreds by those dark-neck insectoid monsters was going to haunt him for the rest of his days. The enemy would be approaching only from the east as the valley boxed them in, so, at the very least, he could plan for some defense. He was sitting at a table covered in maps, lost in thought as to what to do when he saw it. A lute was leaning against the wall in the corner. He had learned the instrument when he was young and would often play it when he had the chance when on campaign. That's when inspiration struck him. A few generals in the humanities history had faced similar, if not identical, situations like the one he found himself in currently, but he could emulate them. He would use caution and suspicion this race held for humanity, and weaponize it. Calling for the young commander, he laid out his plan. "Will this work?" he asked incredulously. "Think of it this way. It'll either work or we'll die a little quicker," the general answered with a smirk. Veritable bloodbath was leading his legion to the latest human fortress. After a great victory where they forced these humans with all their schemes and traps into a real fight, he was pleased to be leading the force to hunt down the one human leaders that had escaped their clutches. General Domain was famed for being a master of traps and ambushes, always preferring to whittle away at his enemies, leave them shredded, then swoop in for a coup de grace. But not this time. Domain's army had been amongst those killed in the Pellis field. Now they would traced him to this little fortress city named Lute. He knew his forces outnumbered Domain's troops to such an absurd degree that only a fool would think to fight. It was during these musings that his forward scouts had brought back a somewhat confusing report. "What is it?" Bloodbath snarled at the nameless scout. "Apologies, my lord, but the fortress has no soldiers on its walls," the scout quickly replied, retreating a few steps in terror. "None?" Bloodbath shouted in confusion. "Indeed," the scout hastily replied. This was worrying. Had Domain already abandoned the city and its people to his wrath? This seemed to be most likely outcome. He had simply taken the troops still there and ran. He was saving his cowardly skin. It disgusted him even more than he cared to admit, especially as he had once considered Domain a comrade, albeit one from a rival people. With resolve, he pressed on till he reached a point where he could overlook the entire city. It was late in the evening, and the sun was already setting. He decided it would be best to leave the assault till the next day. No point in attacking a walled fortress city in the night. His men would just end up attacking each other. It was midnight when he was awoken by a commotion. Stepping out of his tent, he grabbed the first officer he saw. "What's happening? Is it a night raid?" he shouted. "No, sir. Something is happening in the city," the officer hastily replied, running to the crest that overlooked the city. Quickly following suit, Bloodbath saw every torch and brazier along the city walls had been lit. Straining his eyes, he could see more torches lit about the gate. They could make out silhouettes walking along the ramparts. To his surprise, the gate opened, and a human soldier stepped out. So they were right out to face us. Bloodbath could feel the battle endorphins begging to be released. But the soldier wasn't followed by anyone else. "Do they mean to treat with us?" Bloodbath asked aloud, to no one in particular. What happened next, though, only confused him. The soldier began hitting a large war drum. The loud boom was echoing off the walls. Boom! 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 Again and again, the soldier struck the instrument. "Are they inviting us to attack?" an officer asked. "Nay, it must be a ritual of some kind. Humans have many strange customs," another posited. Bloodbath himself was mystified. What were these humans doing? Had they gone mad in the face of the enemy? But as fast as the commotion started, they'd finished with the soldier returning behind the gate, and then firmly closing it. Breeding doubt and confusion, very few of the command slept that night. It was only when the sun rose that they could get back on track. Leading the column, as was the right of his general, rode towards the city. He began to hear the sweet tune of strings being struck. Arriving at the city gate, he was shocked to see it open. There sat the relaxed position on an overlook above the gate was General Domain. He was calmly strumming a lute, playing the sweet tune he had heard upon his approach. "Do you surrender the city, General?" Bloodbath snarled at the insolent human. "Of course! I have come to welcome you with my music to the city with many narrow alleys and hidden spots ripe for ambushes," Domain replied, punctuating each reply with a light plucking of string. This began to concern Bloodbath. This was a general famed for his trickery. "How many men do you have under your command?" Bloodbath demanded. "Less than 150, Domain answered. Bloodbath was sure now that this was a trap. What lunatic would open the gates to an easy-to-defend city when they only had 150 men? "You don't expect me to believe that number, do you?" Bloodbath asked incredulously. "It is not whether you believe it or not, for it is simply the truth. Please allow me to be your guide. I shall show you all the most beautiful secluded spots away from your men," Domain replied with a grin oozing venom. "So you can kill me, no doubt," Bloodbath thought. "What would you do should I send my whole army in?" Bloodbath probed. "Why, there is nothing I could do," Domain replied, emphasizing the I. Bloodbath was now beyond certain. This was a trap, one where they would be slaughtered to a bug, where he would have to submit his men to his namesake. But he could be smarter than Domain here. He could refuse to fall into such a trap. "I must apologize, Sir Domain. I must refuse your hospitality," Bloodbath said with a forced melancholy. "Please don't. I put so much effort into welcoming party for you and your men," Domain said after Bloodbath's back as he was already turning his men around to march to a different goal. "I still refuse to believe that worked," the young commander said from behind a post near the general. "In all honesty, I didn't think it'd work either. But when they didn't charge right in when you played your epic drum solo, I knew their commander was cautious due to my reputation," Domain explained. "And I just have the nastiest reputation for being a scheming, backstabbing trickster who will trap and ambush any enemy. So all I had to do was play into that perception," Domain said with a grin. "Well, one thing is for sure, you are going to end up in the history books for this one," the young commander said with his own grin. "Not just me. Good old Bloodbath there will be right there with me. He will never live this one down when he finds out," Domain replied, finally breaking into a hearty laughter. End of story. I would quickly like to thank the T5 channel members and Patreons. Casper Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, Barky, Lord Azrakal, It's Difficult to Pronounce, Dragzoon WRE, Holly's Sister, Arcadian. Thank you very much.